Hello everyone, welcome to another instalment in our lunchtime webinar series in association with AURPO. Today's webinar is on the assessment of delicensing of a nuclear licence site. It's been a while since we did one of these, so just really quickly I'll go through the ground rules before we start. So firstly, questions. You can ask questions at any point during the talk through the Q&A box. You should be able to see that on your screen. It's an icon, the question mark inside a speech bubble. So feel free to click on that and ask any questions as we go along. You can also like any questions that other people have put up there. And at the end, we're going to ask the ones with priority to the most liked ones. Any that we don't get a chance to answer today will be popped onto our website afterwards. Please register your attendance for CPD points. So the info is there on the screen now, and we'll also pop that into the chat so it's there throughout the talk. And finally, please send us any feedback, anything that you liked, disliked, anything we could do better, and any suggestions for any further topics that you might want to see in our webinar series. Next, I have to plug that if you're not already a member, then please join us. We are a lovely bunch, and there are lots and lots of benefits to being a member, all on the slide there. You can get more information on our website. Also, if you've not seen it already, we've got a new edition of our magazine out. There's some really interesting articles in there on the lost Australian source that I'm sure you all saw in the news a while back. Another one on radiation and pregnancy, and one on radiological risk assessments. So have a read of that. And last reminder is just that our European ERPA conference is coming up in 2026. So get those dates in your diary. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker for today. Paul Butler is one of our members of the webinar committee who has volunteered once again to present for us. Thanks, Paul. He has been in the nuclear industry for the past 12 years. Prior to joining the ONR, he was on the Nuclear Graduate Scheme, where he undertook secondments at Nuclear Restoration Services, Sellafield and Nuvia. From October 2014, Paul worked at the ONR as a radiological protection specialist within the radiological protection and criticality specialism. Over these past 10 years, Paul has worked on an array of different projects at ONR, including generic design assessment for UK BWR, UK HPR 1000, undertaking IRR 17 compliance inspections at licensed sites, periodic safety review of nuclear facilities, direct shine assessments, as well as being involved with the assessment of delicensing of nuclear licensed sites. For the past couple of years, Paul has been part of the ONR Transport Competent Authority as one of the transport compliance inspectors, as well as becoming the technical subject matter expert on delicensing of nuclear licensed sites. Paul is also an active member of SRP. He's on several committees, as well as receiving his chartership CRAD-P status earlier this year. Over to you, Paul.
So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this SRP webinar on delicensing of a nuclear licensed site. Next slide, please. So over the course of this webinar, I will talk about three aspects. Firstly, what is the current UK delicensing regime? So with that aspect, I will be talking about what is delicensing in general, what is the current approach in relation to no danger, and what is ONR's interpretation of no danger, as well as what is our specific assessment criteria for delicensing a nuclear licensed site. Then I'll move on to what is the likely future UK delicensing regime and talk about a new approach called proportionate regulatory control, as well as what are the applicable conditions related to proportionate regulatory control and what is ONR's expectations for licensing for these applicable conditions. And finally, part three, I'll just provide some further information where there's further reading and guidance on the ONR website or on the internet. Next slide, please. So what do I mean when I say what is delicensing? Well, this is seen as the final stage whereby a reactor has been decommissioned and demolished, land remediated, and you're left with the end state, as can be seen in the picture within the slide. Now, delicensing can occur when the license is either varied, revoked, or the licensee surrenders the license under Nuclear Installations Act 1965 as amended, or NIA 65, moving forward in this webinar. Now, once there is no nuclear licensed site, the land can then be used for other purposes. And as well as that, once that area has been delicensed, ONR is no longer the enforcing authority for certain legislations for that piece of land. For example, this would be the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 or Ionizing Radiation Regulations 2017. Now, a licensee can either delicense part or all the sites. And as stated already, there is appropriate guidance available on the ONR website regarding the process and what is required from an assessment perspective. Next slide, please. So what is the current approach? So under the law, a nuclear license site can be varied under NIA 65 section 3 if it meets 2 criteria. Now these are the site or part of site is no longer needed for any use requiring such a license, as well as there is no danger from ionizing radiations from anything on that part of the site. Now, in the previous slide, I did discuss that a licensee can also revoke or be surrendered. Now, this is stated within section 5 of NIA 65. However, within this webinar, I will focus on varying a nuclear license site. So I've talked about already that there are 2 current criteria. I want to talk more about the no danger from ionizing radiation and what does this actually mean. Next slide, please. Well, firstly, it doesn't mean no radioactivity on site. That's not possible. Instead, ONR is looking for an acceptable level of risk. So, in ONR's opinion, it is acceptable for there to be a small but finite radiological hazard, where any further remediation will be grossly disproportionate. However, the remaining radiological hazard will not pose a significant ongoing risk to any representative person for any foreseeable uses for the site at present or in the future. So we now have an interpretation of no danger, but is there possible to actually have a numerical value that can be used when assessing if a site has reached no danger level? Next slide, please. So within the document HC guidance, reducing risks protecting people, or R2P2 for short, it states that the risk of death to an individual of 1 in a million per year is seen as broadly acceptable to society. So through public consultation, ONR came up with an interpretation for no danger where any radioactivity above natural background radiation where the licensee can demonstrate the risk is less than 1 million per year would be acceptable. So we can go even further now to maybe see if we can provide a dose rate itself. So within IAEA WSG 5.1, it states that the optimization of protection below 10 microsieverts a year might not be warranted. ONR has used this value for delicensing purposes. Hence, for a nuclear license site to be delicensed, the licensee has to prove that the remaining radiological hazard will not pose a significant ongoing risk to any representative person for any foreseeable uses for the site at present or in the future to a level where risk of death is 1 in a million per year, equivalent to a person receiving a dose no greater than 10 microsieverts a year. Although the 10 microsieverts a year is the where no danger is the limit, I do want to reiterate that if it is not grossly disproportionate to reduce the dose rate even further, then a law applies as well. Next slide, please. So I've talked about no danger and the interpretation of no danger. I now want to move on to what will be the assessment criteria. And firstly, I want to talk about characterization and sampling. So firstly, why does a nuclear license site need to be characterized an area for it to be delicensed? Well, firstly, we need to know what is location and activity of the remaining radiological sources and contamination on the area of land to be delicensed. It also provides an up-to-date information on the area to be delicensed, and this can then be used as evidence to demonstrate that the nuclear license site is compliant with reaching the no danger level. Now, to achieve characterization and sampling, we can use aspects such as information gathering, radiological sampling, and radiological monitoring, which I'll now discuss about in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. So, in the first instance for information gathering, you collect what is known as a history file, whereby you would build a picture of what has occurred on the area to be delicensed to provide initial information of any potential radiological hazards. So this could be through photographs of buildings that were previously there or currently there, survey work that's been undertaken, a look at any potential incidents or records in the past for the area of the land, as well as talk to staff past and present, who have worked at the site. Next slide, please. Once you have gathered that information from the history file, that can then be used to support the sampling and monitoring of an area to be delicensed. Now, I just want to make it clear that sampling and monitoring of the area to be delicensed doesn't mean sample everything, as this is not feasible. Instead, a proportionate approach should be undertaken. So, for example, if an area is to be delicensed has had little to no radiological contamination over the use of the land, then high-level sampling monitoring should be undertaken. However, if it is known or something unexpected is discovered, detailed sampling monitoring should be undertaken. Now, in regards to the methodology, it is actually up to the licensee for sampling what approach they take. However, the approach must be appropriate and satisfy ONR regulatory expectations. So, for an example, an approach that's been used previously for delicensing is the data quality objective and data quality assessment approach. Now, depending on what remains on the area to be delicensed affects how to appropriately sample it. So for potential ground surfaces and underground contamination, the depth of sampling to be undertaken is on a case-by-case basis, but again, a proportionate approach should be undertaken. So, for example, if let's say there was a disused effluent pipe about 5 meters below ground level, then you should sample down to where that pipe was to confirm that there was no contamination or leakage from the pipe. For any buildings remaining after delicensing, appropriate sampling would be on a case-by-case basis, so again, taking core samples of the buildings. Now, licensee may need to take samples below the building to confirm if the ground underneath has been contaminated. And finally, if there is a likelihood for underground contamination, this should include groundwater, the sampling regime should potentially include sampling to the water table. Now, with regards to natural background radiation level, this is including both gamma and from the ground, as well as naturally occurring radioactive material. Prior to the natural background level should be understood prior to operation of the nuclear site, as well as at present, needs to be established. Now, the risk from radon gas from sources not associated with practices that have taken place on the site should not be included in the assessments. In addition, the risk resulting from fallout from weapon testing or incidents at other national or international plants should also not be included within the delicensing assessment. And finally, although non-radioactive contamination does not stop delicensing assessments, where radioactive contamination is co-located with non-radioactive contamination, consideration will need to be given to the risk associated with the presence of the non-radioactive contaminants, such as asbestos, when undertaking delicensing. Next slide, please. So, when assessing a licensee's delicensing application, additional competent independent expertise may be used by ONR to provide independent assurance on the licensee's site characterization data and its interpretation. Now, the intention of this is not to reproduce the licensee survey, but to enable ONR to form a judgment about the adequacy of the licensee survey on a proportionate basis for validation and verification purposes. So ONR would use what is known as a technical support contractor, or TSC for short. Now, the use of TSC by ONR will be considered on a case-by-case basis. The aspects where TSC may not be required are, for example, if, let's say, the history file is appropriately detailed and provides all necessary information to understand what has occurred on the area to be delicensed, or that the area to be delicensed has no history of work being undertaken, which could have led to a radioactive contamination. This could include from any waste disposals, laydown area use, or storage of items that could have been contaminated. The initial sampling monitoring survey results from the licensee are indistinguishable from natural background in the relevant part to be licensed. The methodology of the sampling monitoring for the relevant part is considered suitable and sufficient, as well as confidence has been gained where appropriate from previous satisfactory delicensing application by licensee, where a TSC validation verification is no longer needed for that delicensing application, or potentially that the licensee uses a UK accredited services approved laboratory for assessing the sampling undertaken. Now, that was not a non-exhaustive list, though any use of a TSC by O&R will be discussed with licensee as early as practical in the delicensing application. Next slide, please. What other key aspects are considered for assessment criteria? Well, firstly, the involvement of other regulators. So a statutory requirement of NIA 65 is that O&R has to consult with the appropriate environment agency on the delicensing application. So this would be either the EA, NRW, or SEPA. Now, although they are the only statutory requirements of a regulator we need to discuss with, it could be that other interest regulators should be consulted regarding the delicensing of a nuclear licensed site. So, for example, Defence Nuclear Safety Regulators, or DNSR, would be interested in a nuclear licensed site where defence-related work is carried out and wants to be delicensed. Also, it could be that the Office for Road and Rail, or ORR for short, would have an interest if a rail or road went through the relevant part to be delicensed. Now, although the delicensing application covers mostly nuclear safety, there are aspects which could affect the other O&R purposes, such as security, safeguards, transport, and conventional health and safety. So for those other O&R purposes, the O&R inspector would have to discuss internally within O&R if any of them are affected by the delicensing application. And finally, it is considered good practice for the licensee to have a living document which records the common position of the stakeholders on various issues that arise during the lifetime of the delicensing project. This could include, but not limited to, the summary of work to be undertaken, technical guidance, changes to documents since last issue, arrangements in place. This could include governance of the process, and justification for delicensing work to be undertaken. Again, this living document should be shared with all stakeholders, and they should all have a say within what goes in the licensing agreements and assumptions documentation. Next slide, please. So going back to what was the criteria to fill. So there again, I said there were two criteria. The first criteria is that licensee must demonstrate that any prescribed activity for which a license is required, these are stipulated within NIA 65 Section 1, as well as the Nuclear Installations Regulations 1971, or NIR 71 for short, are no longer being conducted on the relevant part to be delicensed. Once that has been confirmed, again, as already discussed, licensee must undertake characterisation of the area to be delicensed and provide evidence to O&R on samples undertaken and methods to reduce radiological hazard to below the no danger levels. As well as that, need to then prove that the area to be delicensed has actually met the no danger level. Now, there are a number of published documents that can be used to calculate if the remaining activity on the area to be delicensed has met the no danger level. Now, these documents are the IAEA GSR Part 3 Table I2 or the NRPB W36 documents. Within these documents, they provide a table which forms what of certain radionuclides and what level they will be to meet 10 microsieverts. Now, although these two documents are widely used, and it is ONS expectation that these are used, it is understandable that there may be a radionuclide not covered within that document. All licensee can use their own values. However, in those cases, the licensee must demonstrate that these values meet the no danger level. As well as that, there needs to be appropriate record keeping of what has occurred. Next slide, please. So, in that aspect, I talked about the current approach that is used for delicensing a nuclear licensed site. I now want to talk about the future or likely case, and that is proportionate regulatory control. So this approach allows a licensee to delicense a nuclear licensed site earlier than the no danger approach, as you don't need to demonstrate you have met no danger levels. Instead, this approach is to delicensing provides a proportionate approach for decommissioning and cleanup, where the radiological and other hazards and risks are similar to conventional industrial facility. Now, these aspects are provided with the Energy Act 2023 Part 14 Chapter 1, which provides what amendments are required to NIA 65. Next slide, please. So this diagram provides hopefully a better understanding of what I mean by proportionate regulatory control. So in the top of the diagram, you see the typical life cycle of a nuclear licensed site, going from design and construction to commissioning operation, defueling, decommissioning, finally into final states of decommissioning cleanup. Then below is roughly the natures of the risks of nuclear, radiological, conventional. So as can be seen, the nuclear and radiological risks reduced considerably after the site has defueled and entered decommissioning phase, to the point that the radiological and nuclear hazards have reduced compared to the conventional hazards. Hence, at that point, it is considered disproportionate to have a nuclear license regime. This is where PRC would take effect, whilst no danger would currently be undertaken at the final stages of decommissioning and cleanup. Next slide, please. So what are the changes within legislation? Well, as stated already, due to the Energy Act 2023, there are amendments to NIA 65 to bring PRC into legislation. Currently, when you delicense, you end the period of responsibility at the same time as delicensing. However, moving forward, if a licensee wants to end just the period of responsibility compared to delicensing, there are slight differences in the conditions a licensee needs to meet. HC will become a statutory consultee along with the environmental agencies. Now, there is also a new type of relevant part discussed, which is a prescribed disposal site, as mentioned. Though this is in relation to what is known as a geological disposal facility, which at present there aren't any within the UK. There's also information on approach to delicense a licensed disposal site is also provided with the amended NI 65 legislation. I just want to note that for a licensed disposal site is used, this will be for the operation of an installation for the disposal of nuclear matter, and it will be being approved by the authority to have an appropriate permit. When off a nuclear licensed site, a licensed disposal site is called a relevant disposal site, whilst when on a nuclear licensed site, it's called a licensed disposal site. And just for reference, there is now guidance being written by DESNZ regarding the criteria to end the period of responsibility for a licensed disposal site. Further information regarding that can be requested from DESNZ. Next slide, please. So within the Energy Act, it defines a number of what is known as applicable conditions or criteria that need to be met for an area of the site to be delicensed, or relevant parts as they're now called. Now, the majority of these applicable conditions, or ACs for short, originate from the appendix to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development of Nuclear Energy Agency, or OECD-NEA, from the 2014 discussion on the application of the Paris Convention to nuclear installations in the process being decommissioned. As stated already, these applicable conditions are seen as less stringent than the current no danger from ionizing radiations from anything remaining on the site. And as stated already, these applicable conditions define different types of relevant parts, such as nuclear installations, other areas, these would include potentially car parks, admin buildings, etc., as well as the prescribed disposal sites already discussed. Now, there is also the licensee can still voluntarily elect to use the no danger criteria for delicensing. Now, depending on the aspect that is to be delicensed or relevant part, depends on which applicable condition is valid. Next slide, please. Which I'll discuss in this slide. So as can be seen, on the left-hand side are the different applicable conditions. I'll discuss these applicable conditions in the upcoming slides. Whereas for the relevant part, defines which applicable condition is relevant. So again, for nuclear installations in the process of decommissioning, all the applicable conditions are required. Whereas for a licensed disposal site or other area, only dose exclusion criteria and determination whether a nuclear site license is needed or desirable is required. Now, as stated already, the no danger from ionizing radiation is still applicable, and licensee may elect to apply this when, if they do go for this route, then no other applicable conditions are required. What I'll do now is I'll now discuss about these different applicable conditions and what is ONR's regulatory expectations regarding these applicable conditions. Next slide, please. So the first applicable condition is use of the installation has permanently ceased. So again, this is similar to what is already required under the current legislation, whereby a licensee will need to provide evidence that the delicensing application to demonstrate that the nuclear installation will not be used for original purpose. or any other nuclear licensable activity under NIA 65 or NIR 71. It probably should be noted that by the point a licensee should submit a delicensing application, a nuclear installation should be in the final stage of decommissioning, and it would be very unlikely it could be used for its original purpose or any other nuclear licensable activities. I should point out that a nuclear installation is seen as something which is a nuclear reactor or potentially storage of fuel element. The second, next slide, please. Thank you. The second applicable condition is appropriate measures for the containment and control of any remaining radioactivity are in place. So, ONR's interpretation of AC2 is that there are suitable and sufficient containment and controls in place to detect and mitigate the release of radioactivity from a nuclear installation. So again, characterization will need to be undertaken to understand for the location, activity, form, and type of radionuclide within the nuclear installation. In addition, the licensee should state how the radioactivity is contained within the nuclear installation. So, for example, is this fixed or loose within the fabric of the building? And what are the control measures currently in place? Now, to achieve this, the licensee should provide justification that they are compliant with IR 17. Now, although the licensee has several duties under IR 17, there are specific regulations of interest for the delicensing application. These include, but not limited to, ones such as Regulation 8, Radiation Risk Assessments, Regulation 9, Restriction of Exposure, Regulation 13, Contingency Plans, and Regulation 20, Monitoring of Designated Areas. As part of the review assessment of the delicensing application, may want to undertake what is known as an IR 17 compliance inspection to review what are the suitable and sufficient controls in place. Next slide, please. So for the next applicable condition, a radioactive exclusion criteria, this is for nuclear installations where the radionuclides chosen, as seen within this table, within this document, are generic, and they are for reactors, fuel fabrication, enrichment, and fuel process installations. Hence, the radioactive exclusion criteria is considered as a prescriptive screening test by ONR. Now, as stated within the webinar, licensees should compare the radionuclide activity limits stipulated in the table against the characterization or historical data they have, as well as other relevant documentation. I would like to note that this table is actually from the OECD NEA paper, and it provides further clarification why these values were chosen. I just want to also note that fixed activity is activity embedded within the nuclear installation and can't be easily removed through wear and tear or dismantling of the facility, whilst all other forms of activity is activity which can be released through decommissioning. Next slide, please. With regards to the dose exclusion criteria, this is for all relevant parts to be delicensed, where the licensee should provide a dose assessment demonstrating the radiological off-site affected dose from the relevant part to be licensed is not greater than 1 millisievert per year to a representative person. Now, this assessment should include an evaluation which includes all reasonably foreseeable conditions, including, for example, internal and external hazards such as extreme weather events, erosion, and human and animal intrusion. The assessment must assume no urgent protective actions are implemented. Now, to achieve this characterization data undertaken as part of the delicensing application can be used, as well as any previous dose assessments produced under the regulatory regime. For example, if the whole or part of a nuclear site is to be delicensed, then a hazard evaluation assessment can be used, maybe one that was required under Regulation 4 of the Radiation Emergency Preparedness and Public Information Regulations 2019, REPIA 19. When calculating off-site dose to a representative person from the relevant part to be delicensed, the licensee should model all relevant exposure pathways. And I just want to note that if more than one nuclear installation or other area is within the relevant part to be delicensed, then the combined off-site dose to a representative person must be below the 1 millisievert per year. Next slide, please. Now, with regards to AC4, determination of whether a nuclear site license is necessary or desirable, This was included into NI 65 and is not originally from the OECD NEA paper. This was included as it was recognised that the other applicable conditions already discussed did not cover all aspects that need to be considered when delicensing if a new licensed site is still needed or desirable in the interest of safety. Also, this applicable condition can confirm there is no significant operational issues that may affect the remaining new licensed site if the relevant part is to delicense. So for this applicable condition, there are three specific aspects that ONL will be assessing. Firstly, there are no prescribed activities that require a new site license taking place on the relevant part. So as I have already discussed within AC1, that the use of the installations permanently cease, this covers nuclear installations within the relevant part to delicense. However, this is not the same for other aspects, as already discussed, maybe such as other areas within the relevant part. Now, it is reasonably foreseeable for part of the fuel pin is identified or radioactive matter above the bulk quantity limits or another kind of prescribed activity is occurring within a non-nuclear installation. Hence, the licensee should demonstrate that the remaining work on the relevant part to delicense do not require a nuclear site license by confirming that none of the prescribed activities stipulated within NIA 65, Section 1 are occurring or NIR 71. The second bullet point is the removal of the license would not lead to a detriment in regulatory control of the safety for decommissioning activities likely to take place on the relevant part. So what I mean by that is there could be work being or likely to be undertaken on the relevant part where, if delicensed, there will be a detriment in regulatory control between the regulatory powers provided by the license and the relevant health and safety and environment legislation. Now, if this was the case, then it may be desirable to keep the nuclear site license for the relevant part. Delicensing should not lead to any significant diminution in regulatory control of safety. For example, the risk of radiation exposure is not appropriately controlled when the dose to workers or members of the public are not reduced so far as is reasonably practicable. Now, the inspector may ask the licensee to demonstrate that it would be disproportionate for any remaining work on the relevant part, for example, demolition, site radiation, accumulation or storage of radioactive material, to require any other regulatory controls contained within the nuclear site license. The final bullet point is that the operational or decommissioning work being undertaken on both the relevant part to be licensed and the remaining nuclear licensed site are not likely to have a significant adverse effect on each other in relation to safety. Now, what I mean by that point is it goes into several other aspects, such as the operational conditions, prevention of accidents and impact on the relevant part in relation to the remaining nuclear licensed site, off-site dose from the remaining nuclear licensed site, and deliberate partitioning of a nuclear licensed site. So for operational condition, prevention of accidents and impact on the relevant part in relation to the remaining nuclear licensed site, this is dependent on the size and location of the relevant part to be licensed. You don't want it where operation decommissioning on the relevant part may have an adverse effect on the remaining nuclear licensed site or potentially an adjacent nuclear licensed site. So what I mean by that is, for example, is that there is now may potentially be insufficient space on the nuclear licensed site to continue undertaking key work, for example, decommissioning of a nuclear installation. If there is an accident on the nuclear licensed site, the relevant part to be licensed will not cause an adverse effect on the prevention mitigation arrangements on the nuclear licensed site. Again, access and egress to the nuclear licensed site could be affected by delicensing the relevant part, whereby it causes an adverse effect. Again, may have to cause emergency service to have to take a longer route to reach the incident. Could affect the impact on security arrangements for the nuclear licensed site, or could lead to what is known as delicensed islands within a nuclear licensed site, whereby operational conditions, as stated already, could affect the remaining nuclear licensed site. So, to prevent this, licensees should provide information that states the location and size of the relevant parts to be delicensed is manageable and minimises, so far as is reasonably practicable, the effect on the operational perspectives for the nuclear licensed site. For example, the relevant part has appropriate arrangements in place. Now, it is also reasonably foreseeable that if a relevant part were to be delicensed from the remaining nuclear licensed site, the nuclear licensed site boundary will change to potentially be nearer to the remaining nuclear installations on the nuclear license site. Now, this could lead to a change in potential off-site doses to members of the public. If the change in the off-site dose is significant to the point that there is an undue radiation risk to the public, it would deem desirable for the relevant part to remain part of the nuclear license site. Licensee should provide justification that the off-site dose from the remaining nuclear license site will not significantly change, thereby resulting in undue radiation risks to members of the public from delicensing the relevant part. Examples where ONR may deem it desirable to keep the nuclear site is in relation to potentially the REPIA 19 threshold, as well as direct shine assessments. And finally, it is acknowledged that during the course of the life cycle of a nuclear license site, a licensee may choose to delicense different areas in a phased manner, possibly over many years. However, this approach must not be undertaken in a way whereby the licensee is usually delicensing to partition small areas of the nuclear license site, which by themselves would meet the relevant applicable conditions, and when considered as a group or whole may not meet the relevant applicable conditions. The outcome of delicensing should present no additional radiation risk to a representative person off-site, who may be exposed to radiation from all radiological sources from both the individual and combined relevant parts to be delicensed and the revised nuclear license site. In addition, licensee must demonstrate that all on and off-site doses are reduced so far as is reasonably practicable. Next slide, please. And the final applicable condition is, of course, no danger. Again, as already said, no danger. The approach is, as previously stated within the webinar, and licensee can elect to use this method rather than using the other ACs. Sorry, applicable conditions, apologies. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I've just discussed there the applicable conditions, as well as what is ONR's regulatory expectations. So what is the current status of PRC? So ONR has written draft guidance regarding PRC. This is within NS-GD 110. Now, however, due to current amendments required to the environmental legislation, which are still being discussed internally within DESNZ, the amendments to NI 65, which would have brought the changes into law, is on hold, and ONR awaiting DESNZ for when the changes will be enacted to publish the guidance. ONR are not aware at present of a date at when they will come into force. However, in the meantime, ONR have updated the guidance regarding to no danger within this document. This will replace the previous guidance, which is NS per Pol 001 and NS per GD 019. This new document will soon be available on the ONR website, and the aspects that I've discussed already within this webinar will be within that document, as well as further information. Next slide, please. So I just want to have a quick discussion over further information that is available. So with regards to ONR documents, as I've already said, there is the NS-GD 110, which will soon be available on the ONR website. This will cover no danger aspects. And when PRC comes into force, that document will then be updated to include the aspects already discussed in this webinar. There's also NS per Prop 004. This goes into more discussion about the delicensing process for existing licensed nuclear sites. With regards to IAEA documents, there are a number of them, such as GSR Part 3 that I've already discussed, GSG 17, which provides further details on GSR Part 3 aspects, and GSG 18, which provides methodology and approach used for clearance of buildings, as well as service contamination, as well as WSG 5.1. Other documents I've discussed is, of course, the HC Reducing Risks Protecting People, as well as the NRPB W36. And I forgot to mention the ONR document called PRC FAQ. This provides is a proportionate rate control technical Q&A for frequently asked questions regarding the new approach. Next slide, please. So I just want to say thank you very much for listening, and hopefully from this webinar, you now have a better understanding of what is the current UK delicensing regime, what is delicensing, what is ONR's interpretation of no danger, and what is the current assessment criteria. Have an understanding of the likely future UK delicensing regime, specifically the new approach of proportionate regulatory control and the applicable conditions. And finally, where to go to get further information and guidance. Thank you very much for listening to my webinar.